Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Tuesday everybody. Let's begin today's video by moving through the most salient economy-related updates. If you enjoy the video or get some value from it, please don't forget to hit that like button. Yesterday, Monday, the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, published new official data for new bank lending for the month of October. According to the numbers, Chinese banks extended 738.4 billion yuan, approximately $100 billion in new loans in October, down from 2.31 trillion yuan in September, but exceeding the expectations of economists in both a UK-based Reuters poll and a US-based Bloomberg survey. Speaking on the data, Wan Bin, chief economist at Minsheng Bank, expressed, quote, affected by factors such as seasonal effects and unsteady economic recovery, October bank lending dropped month on month, but the overall trend remains stable, end quote. Household loans, including mortgages, contracted by 34.6 billion yuan in October. Corporate loans fell to half a trillion yuan. Total social financing, however, that is all debt in the system, rose by 1.85 trillion yuan in October. Government borrowings represented a disproportionately high share of the borrowing, and the private sector a disproportionately low share. On this data, Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis expressed today, quote, this reinforces the idea that government spending, especially on infrastructure, is the driving force behind the recovery of economic activity in recent months. Year to date, total social financing is up by just over 31 trillion yuan to 375 trillion yuan, equal to 31% of the period's GDP. At this rate, China's total social financing will rise nominally by 9.8% over 2023 for nominal GDP growth of 4 to 5%. By the end of this year, total social financing as a share of GDP should rise nearly 14 percentage points to roughly 298%, end quote. There were more concerning data published too, which we will unpack tomorrow. For today though, next up for the economic updates, Goldman Sachs Group Inc. lowered its recommendation on Chinese stocks traded in Hong Kong due to, quote, modest earnings growth, end quote, but maintained a relatively bullish view for shares traded on the mainland. The investment bank expects 10 percentage points earnings growth for 2024 for members of the MSCI China Index and 11% for those on the CSI 300. These, of course, will be off low bases as both have performed very badly over the last 3 years. US-based Bloomberg notes that Goldman has downgraded its target for Chinese benchmarks several times in 2023 already, quote, amid the market's lackluster performance, end quote. In the latest report, Goldman remained overweight on Chinese onshore shares. Sectors related to AI, new infrastructure, and state-owned enterprises restructuring might have a good run, said the analysts. Bloomberg, in a separate article, notes that Morgan Stanley has also highlighted its preference for A shares in a note dated the 12th of November, while staying equal weight on China overall. In the Morgan Stanley note, analysts express, quote, the hurdles ahead to the sustainable China equity market recovery are still very high, with mounting macro pressure on earnings coupled with currency weakness. Next year might be a defining year for China to start systematically addressing long-term structural challenges, which have deterred further long-term allocation at the current juncture. Next year might be a defining year for China to start systematically addressing long-term structural challenges, which have deterred further long-term allocation at the current juncture, end quote. We will see. Next up, this Wednesday, Biden and Xi will meet in San Francisco for a 4-hour meeting. The world will be watching and we will be following the event very closely. In preparation for this meeting, on Saturday we did a big 20-minute deep dive into the China-US relationship. Today we supplement that video with several more salient related updates on the eve of the meeting. Let's begin with some of the international coverage. UK-based The Financial Times writes that the two leaders will try to ease tensions around Taiwan and in the South China Sea. One unnamed US official speaking to the outlet reportedly expressed, quote, "We're not talking about a long list of outcomes. The goals here really are about managing the competition, preventing the downside risk of conflict, and ensuring channels of communication are open." End quote. Rick Waters, who until August was the US State Department's top China official and is now managing director at the consultancy Eurasia Group, told the outlet that Xi and Biden wanted to prevent a further slide in relations, quote, "at the lowest possible cost." End quote. Adding, quote, "The question is how much they can really stabilize relations given the tests they face over Taiwan, technology policy, and other aspects of a fundamentally competitive relationship." End quote. US-based The Wall Street Journal writes that with only weeks to go to prepare for a possible summit with the two leaders, Chinese officials floated a plan. If Xi Jinping agrees to meet, he first wants to sit down with a banquet with American business leaders. The White House, the outlet reports, said no. With a lengthy agenda of friction points to go over, Xi should see Biden first before the CEOs, said the White House. This does suggest that Beijing is seeking stabilizing relations at this point, primarily to give it space to fix its many economic issues at home. Indeed, Dongshu Liu, an expert on Chinese politics at the City University of Hong Kong, expressed yesterday, quote, "Beijing's desire to dial down tensions with the US are part of a clear trend, and I think it is partly due to the fact that China has economic crises. China faces huge pressure, and it needs to at least reassure foreign investors and foreign countries that China is still willing to be open to the world." End quote. US-based Bloomberg reports that China is considering unveiling a commitment for Boeing's 737 jetliner during the APEC summit in San Francisco, quote, "as a signal of a recent thaw between the two nations. Terms of the potential agreement are still under discussion and could change or fall apart before the heads of state meet on Wednesday." End quote. The US manufacturer hasn't made any significant sales of its best-selling narrow-body jets in China since at least 2018. Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post reports, citing two unnamed sources, that Biden and Xi are, quote, "poised to pledge a ban on the use of artificial intelligence in autonomous weaponry, such as drones, and in the control and deployment of nuclear warheads." End quote. Commentators are skeptical of this, however. In the current environment, how could either side trust that the other would keep this commitment? Indeed, this week the US-based Chicago Council on Global Affairs published its most recent Chicago Council survey on American global attitudes. The survey found that a majority of Americans, 58%, view the development of China as a world power as a critical threat to the interest of the United States. Quote, "This is the highest recorded level of concern since the Council first asked the question in 1990. This year also marks the first time since 2002 that at least a narrow majority of Republicans, 71%, Independents, 53%, and Democrats, 52%, all view China's rise as a critical threat." End quote. The whole survey is deeply interesting, and we will explore it in further detail in another video later this week. For now, we continue with our US-China coverage ahead of the Biden-Xi meeting. State media appears to have greatly toned down its anti-US coverage ahead of the meeting. Quote, "The propaganda preparations for the Xi-Biden meeting this week are making it clear it is okay to like America and Americans again. It is all a bit head-spinning, and so far there is no indication that this should be interpreted as anything more than a tactical shift as part of the efforts for a near-term stabilization of US-China relations. And in fact, I think you could make the argument the propaganda 180 makes Xi look like he is quite eager for a stabilized relationship because of at least economic, if not also political pressures." End quote. On Monday, party mouthpiece The People's Daily published a special long piece called "Develop China-US Relations with an Attitude of Responsibility to History, to the People and to the World." expressing, quote, "The ups and downs in China-US relations in recent years show that both countries should always follow the three principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation." End quote. And, quote, "The recent difficulties in China-US relations do not serve the fundamental interests of the people of both countries. The cost of decoupling and breaking chains will ultimately be borne by the people, and hindering exchanges cuts off the channels of mutual understanding and affection." End quote. Of course, these are all fair-weather words. We now move on to words which may demonstrate perhaps a more accurate articulation of Beijing's feelings towards the US and the West generally. Veteran China journalist at US-based The New York Times, Chris Buckley, has published a piece this week based on a book he was able to obtain on speeches she gave to the People's Liberation Army between 2012 and 2016, back when Washington believed it enjoyed fairly stable and warm relations with Beijing. The speeches, however, suggest that even back then, the Chinese elite generally, and Xi Jinping specifically, harbored very dark views of American intentions. We end today's video by quoting excerpts of Buckley's article titled, "Behind Public Assurances, Xi Jinping Spread Grim Views on the US." Directly. In Mr. Xi's telling, China sought to rise peacefully, but Western powers would not accept the idea that a communist-led China was catching up and could someday overtake them in global primacy. The West would never stop trying to derail China's ascent and topple its Communist Party, he said in speeches to the military that are largely unreported by the media. Despite his assurances to President Obama not to militarize the South China Sea, Mr. Xi told his senior commanders in February 2016 that China must bolster its presence there, saying, "We've seized the opportunity, eliminated intervention, and sped up the construction on South China Sea islands and shoals, achieving a historic breakthrough in maritime strategy and defending maritime rights." In the years that followed, China quickly expanded its military infrastructure in the area. "The faster we develop, the bigger the external shock will be, and the greater the strategic blowback," Mr. Xi told Chinese Air Force officers in 2014. Mr. Xi underscored that his judgment of the challenge posed by the United States remains unchanged, saying with rare public bluntness in March, "Western countries, led by the United States, have implemented all-round containment, encirclement, and suppression of China." Mr. Xi warned that the People's Liberation Army was still dangerously backward and could fall behind if it did not seek to innovate, particularly in upgrading its weaponry and command organization. In these speeches, Mr. Xi did not say that war was unavoidable, but he made clear that without a formidable military, China would not be able to assert its will. In international contestation, political operations are very important, but ultimately it comes down to whether you have the strength and whether you can use that strength, he told the commanders on the Central Military Commission in November 2015. Relying on a silver tongue won't work. Here ends the direct quote and today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful Tuesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.